Hello and welcome to the Inside Intelligence webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion with Ambassador John Sullivan on Russia's war against the West. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. Michael Ard, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Science in Intelligence Analysis program.
Thank you very much, Peter. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Inside Intelligence. We're very pleased and honored to have with us today Ambassador John J. Sullivan, who was the former U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and also former U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2019 to 2022. He's a distinguished fellow at the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University and a distinguished fellow at the School of International and Public Affairs of Columbia University. He serves as a contributor to CBS News, is quoted frequently in international media as a leading authority on foreign affairs, and has authored a book on his experience as ambassador, Midnight in Moscow, published by Little Brown in August 2024. Ambassador Sullivan is a member of the board of directors of the U.S. Institute of Peace, after his nomination by President Biden and unanimous confirmation by the U.S. Senate. He is a congressional appointee who serves as a member of the Bipartisan Commission on the Reform and Modernization of the Department of State. Thank you very much for being with us today, Ambassador Sullivan.
Michael, it's great to be with you.
And today we're going to talk about your experience with Russia. But let's start with a question basically from the subtitle of your book.
Yeah.
Why this war on Russia's part against the West?
Wow. Well, that's a big question. It's, I think I would, in trying to answer it, I would go back to what President Putin famously said about the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, which is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And what he meant by that was not the loss of Soviet communism, because Putin himself isn't a communist. And in fact, he has said in the past, if you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet days, if you don't have nostalgia for how we lived in Soviet days, you don't have a heart. But if you want to return to the Soviet communist system, you don't have a brain. And I guess it may be hard to be a true communist and have $1 billion palace on the Black Sea. But the catastrophe that he describes, that he's looking to reverse, is the dissolution of the Soviet Union meant that international border of that enormous landmass of 15 Soviet republics, including Ukraine, that disappeared. And the internal boundaries of the Soviet Union, the different Soviet republics, became, in the early 90s, international borders. And with respect to Ukraine, it separates what Putin views as the core of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, which is Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. So he has set about addressing that great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, in effect reestablishing not the Soviet Union, but more in the nature of the Russian Empire. And that involves a war against the West. And he rails against NATO, what he describes as NATO's relentless expansion eastward, which is, in my opinion, a canard. And he will not allow any Eastern Europeans to have any say over their future, whether, that is their view of their future, their security as embedded in the West, whether it's Ukrainians who are seeking membership in the EU, which spurs the original Russian intervention in Ukraine in 2013-14, or NATO membership. So this is a much bigger war against the West, hybrid war. I heard this repeatedly when I was deputy secretary, traveling in Eastern Europe, 2017, 18, 19, before I became ambassador. Eastern European leaders pleading with me to understand and make Americans understand they were already subject to a hybrid war from the Russian Federation. And that's Putin's war against the West. It's much bigger than Ukraine. And I say to my fellow Republicans who are not enthusiastic, some of them at least, in supporting Ukraine, in helping Ukraine defend itself. Okay, well, if that's your view, then what's your strategy for dealing with Russia? And you got to have one. Otherwise, if you're a member of Congress, how have you been supporting defense and intelligence budgets, classified and unclassified, that approach $1 trillion? It's not just all the PRC, it's Russia too. And in our national security strategy under Biden and Trump, the security challenges are 1A, 1B, PRC, and Russia. You got to have a strategy with respect to Russia, because Russia has got a strategy with respect to the United States and the West, and it's aggressive, and it involves a hybrid war. And that's the point. That's why I wrote the book, and hence the subtitle of my book.
And this is not, we aren't using the word adversary here. We're using the word enemy. And that's how they see it, correct?
So J.D. Vance was asked, is Russia an enemy recently? And he said, an adversary. Well, I beg to differ. And I would cite to him, Putin calls us an enemy. He's already said that Russia's at war with us. I was amused when, in talking about, the long delayed decision by the Biden administration to authorize the Ukrainians to use our ATACMS, Putin said, was in September and even early, wow, you do that, then NATO is at war with Russia then. And my first reaction was, excuse me? You've been saying that for years. You started using the word war with respect to Ukraine in September of 2022. You said NATO started a war against Russia in Ukraine. And NATO, of course, is the United States and all of its vassals in NATO. So, yeah, Russia's an enemy, has been at war, and it's not just name calling. It's a hybrid war against us, and it may grow as a result, at least in part, of the decision on the ATACMS.
I was quite interested in the part of your book, especially the decision of you're putting your hat in the ring to be ambassador to Russia, and your longtime interest in Russian studies. And also what comes out very strongly in the book is your interest in George Kennan's writings on Russia. Can you tell us a little bit about your preparation for this when you were
Sure.
confirmed, and how did you decide to start preparing for a very challenging tour?
Yeah, so I really started in late summer of 2019, which is when President Trump agreed with the recommendation of Secretary Pompeo that I should replace Ambassador Huntsman in Moscow as U.S. ambassador. And almost daily briefings. It was almost a full-time job for me in preparing to become ambassador. Briefings at the State Department, EUR Bureau, our Russia experts, INR, and then across the intelligence community. I don't know that there is a single agency, there may be a single agency in the intelligence community that I didn't spend some time visiting, getting briefed on, including NGA. I went everywhere to suck up as much information as I could to prepare. It also helped me prepare for my confirmation hearing, which was my primary interest, at least at the start, was making sure I got confirmed and then finally appointed by President Trump and was sent on my way. But one more thing I should add, Michael, that really helped me learn more than I might otherwise was the pandemic. Once I arrived in Moscow, both myself and there were a number of us, including our station chief, who were we called ourselves geographic bachelors, stranded in Russia without our families I was stuck there for 13 months. Couldn't leave because of quarantine rules and so forth. So I basically lived in the station, and I had a crash course full time from one of our really in the history of the agency, one of our great station chiefs. And we'd spend whole weekends together reading and talking about issues, and we had to break. We're both big football fans. We had to break by 8 or 9 p.m. on Sunday night because we got to get back to watch an NFL kickoff at 1 p.m. But I really did immerse myself in what the US government knows and thinks about Russia, and had a special opportunity for over a year to do that in a way that no US ambassador, I think, prior to my time would have been able to, just because of the circumstances of the pandemic.
You know, it struck me from reading the book that how much continuity there's been to the Soviet approach to the world, and now to the Putin regime's approach, and in the way they handle diplomacy and their very legalistic interpretations of things. And it seemed like George Kennan really, it sounded like his writings, you thought, were still very apt.
Oh, it's uncanny. It really is. You can take lift passages from the long telegram, the X article, et cetera, in Foreign Affairs, the sources of Soviet conduct, and you substitute Putin for Stalin, Russian Federation for the Soviet Union, and it's uncanny. And there are a couple of instances where I'm able to do that in the book. And what's important to know about Kennan is, I mean, he's a Russia expert, one of our great Russian linguists. His former boss, Avril Harriman, who was ambassador when Kennan was DCM, famously said about Kennan that he knew Russians better than he knew Americans. But Kennan didn't distinguish in his writing. If you read it carefully, he used Soviets and Russians, Russia and the Soviet Union interchangeably. And he thought the most important thing about, and we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center, excuse me. And it's the Kennan Institute. This is in 74, right? Heyday of Brezhnev, General Secretary Brezhnev, and the USSR. Kennan's focused on Russia. He says, you got to understand Russia if you want to understand the Soviet Union, the central control in Moscow. And it continues to this day. I mean, that's Putin's point about the great catastrophe of the 20th century is the loss of central control from the center, from Moscow, over those lands that he, Putin, and his predecessors, dating back well in time, back to the Russian Empire, would have said is our Ruski Mir, is our Russian world, is our Russian land. So Kennan was he was a big influence on me as ambassador. My office, attached to my office, was the ambassador's conference room, which is the George Kennan conference room. And there's a bookcase in that conference room that has every book that prolific man who lived a long time that he wrote. So big influence to this day. And some interesting observations, by the way, by Kennan in the 90s, the late 90s, about NATO expansion, which I had to account for in my thinking. Anyway, he's in many ways as relevant today as he was in 46 and 47, in my opinion.
Kennan thought that would be a provocation. Right.
Yes. An unnecessary provocation,
right,
that we in the West, in the United States, didn't understand the Russian mindset. And that was, but what Putin, and I said this earlier, what that concedes to the Russians is their right, their authority to determine for Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians, Romanians, Bulgarians, what they do with their country. Is their future in the West, in the EU, in NATO, or is it in the East? And one thing that Putin's afraid of, he's afraid of competition. He's afraid of a competition of ideas. Another big issue for Kennan and his colleagues who established the Kennan Institute, James Billington, et cetera, is the competition of ideas. And he lost that battle, Putin, in Ukraine, right? He can't, just as he can't subject himself to a free and fair democratic election in the Russian Federation, which he might win,
Right.
but he might not. And he can't run that risk, and that's a fear. Similarly, he can't compete. He won't compete for the hearts and minds, as famous expression from the Vietnam era, for the hearts and minds of Ukrainians, to convince what he considers his fellow Slavic sisters and brothers that their future is East, that they need to be looking to Moscow, not to Berlin, Paris, London, New York. In the list of cities in the United States is long. They are, I've yet to meet a Russian who said, I've worked hard all my life to get the means to live abroad, and my vision for my wonderful life in retirement is in Shanghai or Guangzhou or Beijing.
No, they don't say
They
that.
want to go to London, to Palm
Yeah.
Beach, to Beverly
Sure.
Hills, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, Brooklyn, you name it. So, but Putin, Putin is, he will not compete. He will control, and that's it. He wants control and will take control, just as he does in their so-called managed democracy.
This leads to, I think, a key chapter in your book, which is Putin the Chekist. And you see this as really the key to understanding it.
Yeah, I mean, it's who he is. It would be the equivalent of, I try to think of the right analogy, and it may not be apt, but if you think of a baseball lifer, you think of Pete Rose, right? However, whatever you think about whether Pete Rose should be in the Hall of Fame, Pete Rose at his core, he is a baseball guy. He is all about baseball. Charlie Hustle. For Vladimir Putin, he's a Chekist. He is a KGB man. He's famously said, and this is a common expression, there's no such thing as a former KGB man, right? And he's more than just a KGB man. First of all, he sought out the KGB in Leningrad, right? 50 years ago, knocking on the door, seeking to join. And he had to be told that, son, we find you, you don't find us. But I mean, that's his mindset, right? And as I write about in the book, what you need to understand about the Chekist mentality, the Cheka is a creation of the revolution in late 1917. The Cheka is the original secret police of the revolution, created by Lenin and, ironically enough, a Pole, Felix Dzerzhinsky, descended from Polish nobility, no less, who found this secret police agency, which in turn is responsible for the Red Terror, right? Defending the revolution against class enemies, not bound by law, morals, anything, other than protecting the revolution and the leaders of the revolution, Lenin. And they draw their inspiration from going back in time to the Russian Empire, to the Okhrana under the Tsars, and then the original secret police, the Oprichniki under Ivan the Terrible. And how do we know this? Well, the Oprichniki in history, they were famous for wearing black leather tunics. And the Chekists, were famous for wearing black leather coats. To this day, KGB, FSB men wear black leather coats. That's sort of their one of their cultural identifications is the black leather coat. When Putin, of course, is career KGB, and then before he becomes prime minister, is made the director of the FSB. the principal successor to the KGB. The KGB is split into a Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, and then the much larger FSB, which has its headquarters in the famous Lubyanka. Putin, as FSB director, has on his desk a bust of Dzerzhinsky. Putin celebrates to this day, as do other Chekist KGB men, Chekist Day in December, the anniversary of the creation of the Cheka in December 1917. So this is a real thing. This isn't made up. This isn't my projecting, some psychoanalysis by US intelligence professionals. This is, he himself says he is a KGB man. And what that means is the KGB as successor to the Cheka, and now the FSB as successor to the KGB, they protect the state, and the state in the person of whether it's the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the Tsar, or in Putin's case is Volodin, who is now the Speaker of the State Duma. Putin is Russia, Russia is Putin. And that's what he expects. He expects that he is, he as the preeminent Chekist, as the person who has now taken control of the Russian Federation, he uses the FSB the way the Tsars used the Okhrana, the way Ivan the Terrible used the Oprichniki. So yeah, he will send an FSB colonel to commit a murder on the streets of Berlin? Absolutely. And so you have to understand where he comes from. It's like trying to understand Pete Rose without knowing baseball.
And that brings us to the war. So we did a pretty good job, the US government, the US intelligence community, of identifying that this thing was going to break out. Let's go back a little bit to 2021. What the discussions between President Biden and Putin coming about the same time as our withdrawal strategy from Afghanistan. How do you see these things connected? Are they connected? And what might have been done perhaps on the diplomatic side to have deterred this?
Yeah, so if we look at summer and fall, early winter of 21, of course, the dominant event in U.S. national security foreign policy is the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. And I'm often asked by people, particularly if they're critical of the Biden administration, wasn't it after the debacle in Afghanistan that Putin was decided that he could launch the special military operation? And as I write in my book, that is, in my opinion, that is completely wrong and misreads Putin's long-term intentions with respect to Ukraine and the recent history, what was happening in the summer of 2021 and into the fall. And I think an important event, and I describe it in some detail in the book, that gives some insight into Putin was the meeting between Putin and Biden in Geneva in June, I believe it was June 16th of 2021. The important thing to know is at that meeting, better part of a day between the two presidents, what did they not talk about? Ukraine. They spent a whole heck of a lot more time talking about Afghanistan. Biden raised the U.S. desire at that point, withdrawing from Afghanistan, looking for an alternative counterterrorism platform in Central Asia, which, of course, Putin was not interested in supporting the United States in that endeavor. But as I write in the book, they didn't talk about when Putin had the opportunity face-to-face with the President of the United States, he didn't discuss in detail Ukraine. There was a fleeting reference to on a long list of topics. However, at his press conference, the two presidents did back-to-back press conferences, not joint. Putin spoke first, and the first question from Russian state media, I can't remember which media outfit, but it was Russian state media, Izvestia, I forget. So this is state media, which means it's Putin asking himself a question. And the question was, Mr. President, the most important thing to every Russian is the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. What did you talk about with Biden on that subject? And Putin says, well, yeah, Biden, there was a brief discussion. Biden said he wants Ukraine to comply with the Minsk agreements, and that sounds right. But other than that, so it's important to remember that, because just a few months later, Ukraine is, according to Putin, an existential issue for the continued existence of the Russian Federation, in Putin's words, hinges on his accomplishing his goals in Ukraine, which are to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. The future of the Russian Federation, of Russia as a state, depends on Ukraine and opposing what Putin calls the relentless eastward expansion of NATO. That became an existential issue for Russia between June 16th and around Thanksgiving, our time, our holiday toward the end of November 2021. Why? What had happened between June and November? Nothing. It's just a revelation of what Putin was planning was the kickoff for some sham diplomacy that the Russians engaged in to try, it wasn't addressed to the West or US allies and partners, but to convince what's now called the Global South, those other countries that weren't involved in issues involving Ukraine, that Russia's security was at stake, the West was at fault, or at least as at fault as Russia was for this security problem, and what Putin knew was going to be his invasion of Ukraine. So I draw from all that the conclusion, I can't put a starting date on it when Putin decided he was going to invade Ukraine, but I can tell you, I am confident that in June of 2021, Putin had already decided he was going to accomplish his war aims in Ukraine, denazifying Ukraine, removing the Zelensky government, and demilitarizing Ukraine, either through Ukrainian capitulation or, the favorite Russian expression is military technical means. So then finally, how does Afghanistan figure in that? It wasn't a trigger for Putin to decide, aha, the West is really a colossal failure. I now can seize Ukraine. That's fake news. That's fake history. But it was yet another signal, to the extent that the Biden administration in the late summer and fall into the early winter of 2021 into 2022 is trying to deter Putin from a decision that at that point, in my opinion, he's already made, to try to dissuade him from invading. It undermined our credibility with them. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And as I write in the book, the secretary of the Security Council at the time, Nikolai Patrushev, former FSB director, a Czechist to his core, gives an interview with state media that says, look to the Ukrainians. This is August 19th of 2021, so 7 days before the attack at the Kabul airport. He says to the Ukrainians, it's beyond me why my Slavic sisters and brothers in Ukraine think that they can depend on NATO and the United States. Look what they're doing to their major non-NATO ally in Kabul, and they'll do the same thing to you. So I don't say that it didn't have some influence, but it wasn't a cause or a trigger for Putin to decide to invade Ukraine. It probably made him less deterrable. He wasn't going to be, it just reconfirmed something he had already decided to do, and it was not going to be possible to dissuade him from doing it unless Ukraine capitulated.
One last question from me, and then we'll get to our audience's questions. And everybody, you can put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. Here's my question. We had a pretty good idea when the invasion was going to happen, but and this has been admitted publicly, that we didn't do such a good job in predicting how well the Ukrainians would resist. This was something that somewhat surprised us. Why do you think that is?
Well, what I'd say, Michael, is not only was the United States and our intelligence community surprised at the ability of the will and the ability of the Ukrainians to resist, combined with the lack of ability of the Russian military and their security services in what was a hybrid attack on Ukraine. Combined, the United States, let me put it this way. I, sitting as U.S. ambassador in Moscow, was not prepared by my government to believe that the Ukrainians were going to be able to resist. The Russians would be overwhelming and the Ukrainians would not be able to resist the way they did. So in addition to it being a failure of not just the U.S. IC, but Western intelligence generally, it was a failure by the FSB itself. Because Putin, he met with the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett in March or April of 22, so a month or two after the special military operation started, and he admitted to Bennett that the Ukrainians were stronger and tougher and were able to resist in ways that we had not anticipated. And likewise, he said our military, we weren't as good as we thought we were. So, part of it may be, you think about, for example, think about intelligence issues and intelligence failures. You think about, WMD in Iraq. And to the extent that Saddam is being misled by his own people about WMD programs, if our intelligence signals are that there's something going on there, that may lead to conclusions on our part. Similarly, if the Russian FSB is advising Putin, and we have reason to understand that, if they're expressing confidence, it's not an excuse, but, we should be able to look at the facts ourselves and draw conclusions. But both the United States and Russia failed in predicting how the Ukrainians would react. And I'd say it was a common thing to hear senior Biden administration officials off the record anonymously say things like, after the war started, we know more about the Russians than we do about the Ukrainians. So you're absolutely right. It was a welcome failure in some sense. I'm glad that it turned out the way it did, but it affected U.S. preparation for in anticipation of what was going to happen in our actions before the conflict started.
Let's get to some questions from our audience. Thanks a lot for that response. And I want to, Doug offers a few points here. I want to summarize a bit. You mentioned earlier that the difficulty in getting Americans, including, you mentioned Republicans, right, to start thinking of Russia in terms of being more of an enemy, which is what they consider themselves. Right. How successful have the Russians been in kind of hearts and minds persuading Americans that they need to think about Russia in another way? That are they still being successful at this despite 2+ years of war against Ukraine?
I'm loath to credit the Russians and the Russian security services to having that type of influence over the United States. Certainly they try. They are looking to sow discord, disunity. And at the end of the day, I've had this conversation with my friend and former colleague, General H.R. McMaster. I mean, if you think about it, this is going back to Soviet days. I mean, they really want to crush hope in the West. They want us to think we're just as bad as they are. Disunity and all that. I think the view on the view particularly expressed by some Republicans is a short-sighted political calculation. Some of it is members, I think members of Congress, some of whom say, you know, if Biden's for it, I got to be against it. And I hear, and it's not, you know, I want to be fair about this. You know, Republicans who say things like, I care more about the southwestern border of the United States than I do about Ukraine's borders. I care more about the United States than I do about Ukraine. And what I try to convince them of is you're looking at the wrong side of the equation. You're looking at the wrong side of the front line in the Donbass or in Kursk. You're talking about defending Ukraine. The ultimate interest of the United States is opposing Russian aggression because it's not stopping with Ukraine. So what I try to get people focused on, and the reason for writing my book, the reason for the subtitle, The War Against the West, we need to be talking about Russian aggression, and what it means for the West, this hybrid war against the West. It's being fought now in Ukraine. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for supporting Ukraine. I'm not saying that Ukraine, but Ukraine is the front, is the battlefield where this Russian war against the West is being fought right now. It will not end there. And what I warn people about who are, you know, who are sympathetic to Russia's position, you know, both sides are at fault. You know, there were NATO provocations. The Kennan, you know, drawing on Kennan's views in the late 90s, wrote a famous op-ed in the New York Times, I think it was in late 97, opposed to NATO expansion. It was relentless NATO expansion. We provoked the Russians. Yeah, they shouldn't have launched a war, but we provoked it. I said, you saying those things, you sound like the America Firsters from the late 30s. You know, you see, remember the old movie tone newsreel? There's footage of Americans, average Americans, who say things, and it's not just prominent Americans like Charles Lindbergh, but others who say, you know, geez, Germany really got screwed in the, they didn't say, they didn't talk that way back in the 30s. The Germans were really treated unfairly after the Great War, out of Versailles. No doubt about it. Germany was crushed. Solitary war guild, massive reparations. And the chancellor, yeah, he's rough around the edges. He's got to use some tough means to bring Germany back. But that's all he's doing. He's a good German nationalist. And that's all he's doing. And, you know, once he gets Germany back on its feet, then everything will go back into a better balance. He's just correcting an imbalance out of the Great War. And I tell people, you don't want to be saying that type of thing about Vladimir Putin, because if we survive all this, 80 or 90 years later, people are going to be pointing at you where you say, oh, Russia, Putin's just you know, he's a Russian Christian, an Orthodox Christian, a Russian nationalist. We provoked him. Baloney. And that's why I wrote the book. So it's I would not attribute it all to Russian disinformation. Certainly they're working hard at it, but I would give in some way us in the United States both more credit and discredit with responsibility for our own future, and the lack of leadership on both sides, Republicans and Democrats. This is a bipartisan criticism. There has been a complete lack of leadership about the threat that Russia poses. We've written national security strategies, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, that identifies those security challenges, 1A, 1B, PRC, Russia. But our leaders just saying we'll stand with the Ukrainians for as long as it takes is not educating the American people about the security threats that we face from this country, the largest landmass in the world with the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world, and a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, which used to mean something. It doesn't anymore because the Security Council is now basically a dead letter. It's a lack of leadership. And our leaders used to. You look at back, 44 years ago, the 1980 election, Carter Reagan, right? Leaders, presidential candidates talked about important national security issues and not with slogans. Russia never would have invaded if I'd been president. I'm for Ukraine for as long as it. Reagan and Carter, it had conversations, debates, talked to the American people about what the Soviet Union was about, the threat from the Soviet Union, right? And there was, in some sense, bipartisan consensus to a certain extent, right? Because everyone associates the Reagan administration, Reagan himself, with rebuilding American defenses and, the MX missile, the Strategic Defense Initiative, INF missiles in Germany. What they forget is the defense buildup begins at the end of the Carter administration. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we don't go to the Summer Olympics in Moscow. So Carter, Reagan, Bush 40, presidents and leaders in Congress used to talk substance to the American people about foreign threats like the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. And our leaders aren't, they're either sloganeering or playing politics with deadly serious issues that need to be discussed and explained so the American people understand what's going on in the world.
Kelsey asked about 2014 in Crimea. Was a more vigorous response on our part have been justified then? Should we have treated it similarly to what we're treating 2022?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't hear the man say it himself, but I mean, there have been reports not that long ago that President Biden has said that we screwed up. And I have heard colleagues when I was ambassador who had served in the Obama administration say, we learned our lesson the hard way in 13, 14, and 15. And then in Syria, we learned our lesson the hard way. And we're not going to make the same mistake again. But you know what? My view is he had decided, as I said before, Putin had decided in June of 21 that he was going to accomplish his war aims in Ukraine, either by Ukrainian capitulation or by military technical means. That decision was made sometime between 2015 and 2021. I can't put my finger on it, but it goes back that far. And the message, that's a more significant influence, in my opinion, than Afghanistan on Putin's decision to launch the special military operation in February of 2022. And if recent media reports are to be believed, I understand that Biden may share that view, but again, I haven't heard that. Didn't hear that from him directly.
A lot of great questions. Let's see if we can get to as many as we can. One of our listeners asked about the recent ballistic missile launch. I mean, Ukraine has launched against Russia. Russians are responding. Do you see this as a real major escalation now?
So, I mean, a cycle, I mean, we could go back in time for cycles of escalation. The original catastrophic escalation, of course, was February 24th, 2022, right? And as I write in my book, I draw comparisons toward the end of the book between the German actions, calculations, grievances that lead to the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. And there are some, in my opinion at least, some striking similarities between that calculus and how they went about it and what Putin did on February 24th, 2022. So, my conclusion is Putin had grievances, right? He's got grievances. He's made them clear. Just as Hitler had grievances in 38, in the summer of 39, growing out of the Great War. And I quote Justice Jackson, who was our chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, who conceded the legitimate grievances of Nazi Germany, of the German people, growing out of the Versailles Treaty and what was done to Germany out of the Versailles Peace Treaty, losing not just their colonies, but 10% of their European landmass, solitary war guilt, reparations, etc. There are legitimate grievances. And Germany, this is Justice Jackson speaking, Germany could do anything to address those grievances other than start an aggressive war on September 1st, 1939. Short of war, the Germans had grievances. And by the way, Jackson says the United States contributed to those grievances. But it's not legitimate to say the United States then caused Germany to invade Poland. I say the same thing about Putin's got grievances. And he can negotiate with the United States. He can threaten the United States. What he can't do is he can't launch tanks, missiles, aircraft, drones, send troops over the border, start an aggressive war to address those grievances. So that's the basic escalation right there. Allowing Ukraine to defend itself, this is something that we have, we, the United States, confronted this in Vietnam. North Vietnam didn't have a defense industrial base that could develop surface-to-air missiles that would shoot down a US B-52 flying at 48,000 feet. Those missiles were built in the Soviet Union. They were operated by over 3,000 Russian military experts. There were Russians who were flying combat sorties in Soviet aircraft, shooting down Americans over South and North Vietnam. Similar thing happened in Korea. We support the Mujahideen in Pakistan, opposing the Soviets in Afghanistan. So this has happened in the past, in the Cold War, right? Now, it's different because particularly with the Ukrainian incursion toward Kursk, it's happening on the territory of the Russian Federation. The Soviets weren't shooting down American planes over the United States. But is this an escalation that's worthy of the name escalation? No, this is Ukraine defending itself. And all that's happened with Putin's statement in September about what was coming, the change in nuclear doctrine, which is then formalized, just a day or two ago. This is all of a piece with the nuclear saber rattling that he's been engaged with since before the war started. When I was ambassador, they were talking in those terms then. Now, Putin having drawn a so-called red line in September of this year over the use of ATACMS, which, by the way, have a range of 190 miles. I mean, these are, yes, they're long-range strike weapons, but they're not ICBMs. They're not intercontinental ballistic missiles. A Russian test, the Russians have been trying to develop their Sarmat missile for some time. What I've seen so far is nothing different than what the Russians have been doing before, but it is not my prediction that, having said what he said in September, that Putin will be satisfied with that. So we've seen reports of tampering, undersea cables being cut under the Baltic Sea. My view is that the Russian response to the ATACMS will be, we saw the U.S. Embassy yesterday was closed with a warning for particularly, for warning to U.S. citizens that there was intelligence or reporting that there would be a fairly dramatic strike on Kyiv. I think Putin is going to he's going to double down on the war in Ukraine and on his hybrid war against the West, whether it's trying to blow up commercial airliners, cutting undersea cables. Yeah, that will continue, and that will increase, and that will be his response.
We have a question about the overall cost this war has for both countries, and how do you see this? With the high casualty rate, Ukraine and Russia what's going to be the impact on these two nations?
So I was ambassador to Russia, so I'll focus on Russia first. Everyone talks about, and it is obvious, the difference in size and population and wealth overall of the Russian Federation versus Ukraine. 3 times the population. Russia itself is the largest landmass, country by landmass in the world. Sure, a war of attrition between the Russian Federation and Ukraine disfavors Ukraine, and particularly in personnel, getting trained personnel to the front to actually fight. Having said that, I believe that we in the West have overstated Russia's capacity in several ways. First, Zelensky has to defend Ukraine against Russia. Putin has to defend Russia not only against Ukraine, but against NATO, against our allies and partners in the Pacific, including, I'm not suggesting that South Korea is going to go to war with the Russian Federation, but having been in Seoul just a couple of weeks ago, and I had meetings at the foreign ministry and with a bunch of, my people I know who are former senior South Korean diplomats, to say that the South Koreans are beside themselves about the DPRK sending troops in large numbers, in addition to large numbers of artillery shells, to fight in a war in Europe, to say they're upset about that is a pretty dramatic understatement. So, and of course, Putin's dear friend in Beijing, do the Russians really, in the long term, trust the PRC? Maybe, maybe not. But in any event, my point is, Putin's got to defend the largest country in the world against a lot of other threats. He cannot just turn the Russian military and security for services exclusively to a war against Ukraine. Now, he may be doing it with his strong hand, his right hand, but he's still got to keep his left hand free. And then the other thing I'd say about Russia is that's important to keep in mind, and I consider this a part of the tragedy of what's happened with, and my former boss, Secretary Mattis, General Mattis, sent me an email shortly after the war started, lamenting what Putin had done to his people and his country by launching this war. Think about this. Putin, the Russian government is now on a war footing, right? Their defense budgets, which not that long ago, we're going to start to level off in 2025, 26, 27. They're now at a steep angle up. Payments to both recruit contract soldiers or military contractors, and to compensate the families of those who have been killed or wounded. The costs of the war are escalating. They are increasing, even for non-war related expenses, social expenses in Russia. It reminds me, again, I come back to Vietnam, the famous guns versus butter decisions that in the 60s, with Johnson's Great Society programs and an escalation that sent 500,000 US troops at one point to Southeast Asia, to South Vietnam, leads to persistent and politically dangerous inflation in the 70s into the Paul Volcker administration as chairman of the Fed, having to squeeze that inflation out of the US economy, had a huge impact on our economy, on our politics, etc. What's going to happen in Russia as a result of sanctions, this war, what will be my prediction, I'm not an economist, but the inflation, think about this, the Central Bank of Russia not that long ago raised the prime rate to 21%. One of the most competent, highly talented Russian officials I ever ran across was the current chair of the central bank of Russia. What does she think? She thinks that inflation is a real problem. She's being roundly criticized for this. So, yes, I get it. The war of attrition, the cost, et cetera, and I haven't focused on Ukraine, but focusing on Russia, it's not all rosy for Russia either. And there's both the short-term problem and the longer-term cost that Putin is imposing on his people in Russia's future because of this, what many thought before the war started, misguided and irrational special military operation.
We have a couple more minutes. There's been some great questions. Thanks, everybody. And I hope that we can try to get to a few more here. But one thing that Maria raises something that I think is interesting about Russian spies in Latin America. And someone else asked also about the relationship between Moscow now and some of its former clients in Middle East. How is this war affecting this type of aggressive strategy outside Russia now, and places where it used to have a significant presence, like Latin America and the Middle East?
No, so I almost 40 years ago, I married into an extended Cuban family. So I have a lot of insights, thoughts about this, and think about it quite a bit. In fact, I was in Miami for a book event, Coral Gables, last week at a great bookstore, Books and Books, for a book event on my book, and got questions like this, mostly focused on Cuba, on the homeland, from my family's perspective. But it's broader than that. Of course, it's Nicaragua. It's the huge wound on the South American continent, which is Venezuela. On the one hand, and I saw this when I was ambassador long before the special military operation. So I'm thinking back to 2020 and conversations I had with then Secretary Pompeo, particularly about Venezuela and our strategy for trying to deal with the Maduro government and engage with the Russians on their continuing support for Maduro. And what I found almost 5 years ago now was there was no shaking the Russian support, limited though it may be today, or even back then in 2019, 20. I mean, because as Nikolai Patrushev, the former secretary of the Russian Security Council, said to me once, look, we recognize that the Russian Federation today is not the economic colossus that the Soviet Union was. We were talking about U.S. economic sanctions. So in light of the special military operation, in the Kremlin, their support for Cuba, Nicaragua, the Ortega regime, Ortega and his wife, for Venezuela, is as firm as it's ever been. They just don't have the means to support them the way they used to do. What I focused on, and looking at Cuba, for example, was the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela, which went both ways, with economic support, oil, et cetera, going from Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, and now the security services support for Maduro. My understanding is that a lot of the people who are defending Maduro are Cubans. So it's a continuing problem in this hemisphere that the Russians will continue to support. They just don't have the means that the Soviet Union did to support those countries the way they once did.
Thank you, Mr. Messer. Thank you very much for your response to our questions today. Everybody in the audience, thank you for your active participation. Sorry we couldn't get to all the questions today, but so thank Ambassador John Sullivan for being with us. Congratulations and good luck with your book and your continuing tours of the U.S. on talking to audiences about Russia. This has been a fascinating hour with you.
Thanks, Michael. It was entirely my pleasure. Good to be with you. And everyone else on this program.
And I'd like everybody to join us in a couple of weeks on December 4th, when Ron Drabkin will be talking about Japanese espionage before Pearl Harbor, and a strange case of a double agent in Los Angeles. That'll be a program on December 4th. Please join us then. So we want to thank everyone for joining us today, and look to see you soon. Have a happy Thanksgiving as well.